It's the early hours of June 3rd, 2024, and 3 NYPD cops surround a moped rider on a desolate stretch of road near LaGuardia Airport. The bike's unregistered, and its rider, young, perhaps only a teenager, is riding down the wrong side of the street. He's carrying a DoorDash bag, apparently on his way home from a delivery night shift. But when the trio of cops close, the rider cuts and runs. 2 cops catch up with him, but as they reach him, the rider grabs his delivery bag, unzips it, and pulls out a pistol, a .380 caliber high point. The rider shoots once, hitting an officer in the chest. He rounds on the second cop and slugs him too, this time in the thigh. The second cop draws his own weapon and shoots back, hitting the kid in his foot and ankle. The other cop gets up. The kid's bullet hit his bulletproof vest. He's okay, and they both arrest him. Then he tourniquets his colleague's leg, with blood pouring onto the tarmac. The kid's name, they later discover, is Bernardo Raul Castro Mata. He's 19. He's in the US illegally, and, like so many coming across the country's southern border, he's from Venezuela, a country so broken by crime, corruption and economic decay that a third of its entire population has fled abroad. For some time, officials have feared that members of a notorious prison gang have filtered into US cities along the tired, the poor and the huddled masses. They're called the Tren de Aragua, the Train of Aragua, a region of Venezuela. And according to tattoos they find on Mata's body, the NYPD thinks it's just discovered the gang's patient zero. One of the tattoos, they say, is a clock with an anchor, which officers link to members still holding entire neighbourhoods in Venezuela to ransom. Another is a Nike logo, alongside basketball legend Michael Jordan with his uniform number, 23. It's a reference to January 23rd, the name of a district in the Venezuelan capital city Caracas, and the date of a 1958 revolutionary coup. Mata had been involved in a spate of violent robberies before the shooting, including one just hours before. His asylum case had been dismissed under a White House mass amnesty before being housed in a Queens migrant shelter. There, he'd fallen into the grip of the Tren, snatching purses and jewels on their behalf, and smuggling weapons in and out of the migrant centre with his DoorDash bag. It's common to shoot cops back home, he tells a court 3 weeks later, because Venezuelan cops shoot, quote, gang members for minor infractions. He says his pistol went off by accident. Nobody's buying it. Not least the 66 uniformed officers who've packed out the building to see justice served. Mata faces a whopping 20 charges, including 2 of attempted murder. But authorities are already drawing lines between him and several dozen other cases. There's the brutal slaying of an ex-Venezuelan cop in Miami, for example, and a Baton Rouge sex ring. But Tren de Aragua goons have committed crimes all over the US. Texas, Virginia, New Jersey, Illinois. The train of Aragua, has well and truly entered the station. But how? And, as Venezuela's dictatorship plunges the nation into even more chaos, can anything be done to slow it down? This is the Underworld Podcast. Hello and welcome to the show where 2 seasons reporters tell stories of global black markets, frauds and folks you wouldn't want to meet alone in a dark alley. I'm Sean Williams in New Zealand. I'm joined as always by Danny Gold in New York City. We met during the pandemic and decided to start a podcast, and it's been plain sailing since there. Kind of like loving the time of cholera epic, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, you know what they say about couples during the pandemic? You either got married and had a kid, broke up, or started a podcast. And we chose number 3.
Yeah, well, I chose 2 of those, actually. Now, if you haven't already, subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple, the socials, and we've got videos and posts popping up there. It really helps us keep the lights on over here. And then if you're too hot walking around your northern hemisphere home, or too cold down under, because it's still pretty crap here, why not cool down or warm up with an Underworld Podcast branded t-shirt or hoodie? underworldpod.com/merch for some cool threads or a mug.
Yeah, I think you actually have to go to underworldpod.com and then click on merch. Because I mean, we couldn't figure out the web. Whatever, man. They'll figure it out.
You're being kind to me because, as we both know, that was my job. Anyway, first up, huge congratulations to Nicolas Maduro, who I think last month, as we're doing this, won a third term as president. Wow. Seems like a really close-run thing. He must be really popular to keep winning all those free and fair elections.
Yeah, I hope that Miami Cubans understand sarcasm because I like going down to Florida. I don't want to get chased out.
Well, Marco Rubio probably doesn't, as we'll later learn. Anyway, I guess we can edit this as appropriate depending on what actually happens in maybe a few weeks' time. You know, maybe I have to come out with something like, I can't believe Maduro finally buckled and let the opposition come to power. Or I'll do one more, Dale. Can you believe Nicolas Maduro died in that jet ski accident off the coast of Trinidad? Yeah, you can edit as appropriate, whatever works for the week or two from now. Anyway, yes, this is Venezuela, home of the Bolivarian Revolucion. Chavistas, a country with more proven oil reserves than Saudi Arabia, but a leadership so awful it's now got a GDP per capita lower than the Philippines. It's home to just over 28 million people, and it's lost almost 8 of them in recent years. This is nuts. We'll get to that later on. And yeah, US sanctions have crippled its economy, and it's only going to get worse as Maduro retreats into madness.
I mean, look, I'd love to blame the U.S. for everything, but like that economy was pretty crippled without them because of government mismanagement, terrible policies, and corruption. And I think the majority of the sanctions are, I mean, obviously there's oil stuff, but aren't they on like individuals and companies? Like it's not a like back in the day Iraq sort of thing, right?
Yeah, it's the thing is that they're communists basically. So when you do the individuals, you do the state. I think is what the people there are trying to say. But yeah, I mean, I think that fact that they have more proven oil than Saudi Arabia is mad. Like they would. Well, I mean, at one point they were going to be one of the richest countries on earth, and they definitely aren't now. But
there was a part of that with like, was it Chavez or was it Maduro who like basically took everyone who knew what they were doing in the oil industry and replaced them with like cronies and things of that nature?
Yeah, that was Chavez. Yeah, and then Maduro. Well, he's just a former bus driver who I think he had the brownest nose in the palace. So. I don't know. Someone can write in and tell me I'm wrong about that, but that's what it seems to me. But we are going to look at this issue, obviously, from the angle of organised crime coming out of Venezuela on today's show, and specifically something called the Tren de Aragua. And that is a prison group that has become wildly powerful off the back of a cocktail of corruption, migration, and a strange failed attempt by the Venezuelan state to cordon off so-called peace zones in the capital city, Caracas.
And I mean, if you guys have been paying attention too, they're sort of like the new MS-13 in, I think, American media of the, like this like really scary gang that's garnering a lot of headlines. And obviously they are, as we'll learn, but what the reality is in terms of like what their actions are in the States, you know, I guess we'll learn about that too.
Yeah, there's some toing and froing on what they actually are and how powerful they are. But this episode has got a hell of a lot going on, guys. Caracas has been infamous for crime going back a long, long way, decades, in fact. A pal of mine reported there a few years ago and had all his gear stolen by kids on mopeds at knife point.
Yeah, I've had some friends based there, and it's basically standard to get robbed, like, nonstop.
Yeah, it seems pretty insane. To set the scene, this is the New Yorker's John Lee Anderson, who, well, to pull back the curtain a little bit, I actually just got on the phone with before we recorded this show to do something about his recent reporting in Ecuador, which is going to be coming out soon. Really interesting stuff. But this is him writing way back in 2013. Quote, "Violent crime, or the threat of it, is probably Caracas' defining feature, as inescapable as the weather, which is generally glorious, and the traffic, which is awful, with cars clogging the streets for hours every day. Vendors wade through the gridlock, hawking toys, insecticides, and bootleg DVDs, while drug addicts wash windshields or juggle for change. Spray-painted graffiti covers facades. Trash is piled up on roadsides. The Guaire River, which runs through the heart of the city, is a grey torrent of foul-smelling water. Along its banks live hundreds of homeless indigents, mostly drug addicts and the mentally ill. The wealthier districts of Caracas are fortified enclaves, protected by security walls topped with electrified wire. At gated entrances, armed guards stand watch behind one-way glass. I mean, that makes me genuinely want to go there more. I mean, the key signifier there is the DVDs. Anyone remember those? Let's do a stand-up routine. Of course, the symbol for this incredible urban decay in popular culture is the Torre David, or Torre David, the Tower of David, which is a 45-floor abandoned skyscraper in downtown Caracas, which was taken over entirely by squatters and gangs, kind of the most perfect visual metaphor for a nation in distress. Homeland fans, remember Homeland? Hey, I should definitely do a routine. Might recognise it as the place where Brody's taken to. And this place was actually evacuated in 2018 after an earthquake, so that idea for a story of mine, which everyone else has done, is out the window. But by that point, the Tren de Aragua was well on its way to building a transnational criminal empire.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually really interesting. Like, I'm not super well versed on Venezuelan organized crime, but I'd never really heard of this gang until a year or two ago. But was familiar with the Cartel of the Suns. Have we ever talked about them? They're the kind of like the cartel there that has a lot of high-level government officials in it. I think they're even said to be a part of the government and the military. I might have told a story, I think, about how I became pen pals with a guy who worked as like Maduro's wife's bodyguard, and he flew like coke shipments after teaching. I taught a prison class he was in. I think he got arrested in Colombia and then extradited. But I'm pretty sure he turned witness within like the past year to testify against them and disappeared into the system. But we were trading letters like every few months for a while. So if you're out there, bud, I hope you're doing great. Give me a call. Let's hang out.
But you haven't told that story. That's nuts. When were you doing a prison class?
I got a Pulitzer Center grant for work in El Salvador on the MS-13 guys in the church and all that. One of the stipulations there is that, occasionally they'll contact you to go speak at a university or a panel. And there was a panel down there, and one of the guys on the panel does a lot of programs with prisoners in D.C. I think it's a federal prison there. So I went to teach a class. This is a crazy story, actually. I went to teach a class, and there was a guy in there who looked Latin, and he was wearing a kippah, a yarmulke. Uh-huh. So I was like intrigued right away. And, I spoke to and if you know about DC prisons, like you got to be a pretty badass dude to wear a kippah in a DC prison and like not be intimidated. So right away I was like, all right, who is this dude? What does he do? I taught the class. And afterwards, he came up and started talking to me. His English wasn't great, so we communicated back and forth. But it turned out that he was this like super heavy Venezuelan dude who had got arrested in Colombia, I think, in the wake of like a big shipment. Maybe it was a helicopter, maybe it was a plane of cocaine, and then been extradited to the U.S., and he was just kind of like languishing in this DC prison while they figured out what to do with him. I think they were building a case against Maduro, against Maduro associates, against Maduro's wife. And there's actually an article, I think Reuters eventually spoke to him years later. He was upset about that. And we started trading letters. He would actually write in Spanish. I would get it translated because my Spanish is not good enough to communicate on that level, and just send him stuff. And we talked about, he was asking me to help him communicate with like a rabbi. He wanted to do some holiday stuff, all this sort of stuff. And he was a fascinating guy. And he was always like, I'm going to tell my real story and everything like that. And then I just kind of lost contact with him, and he sort of disappeared from the system. So I assume he was used. I don't know if they filed the charges. I haven't kept up with it since like the letters stopped, but we traded probably like 10 letters each. And I always wanted to do something big with him, but it just didn't work out.
Well, if you're out there and somehow listening to this podcast, then get in touch. The Underworld Podcast at gmail.com. There you go. This sounds incredibly similar to the only time I ever taught a class, which was at Southwestern Oklahoma University, because my mother-in-law at the time was there. And everyone was pretty much silent after I finished talking. No one wanted to ask a question, except for one girl. It was a really big girl who was dressed in a full wizard's outfit with a twisty wooden stick. And she said, "Do you know David Remnick?" And I said, "Nah, not really." And she just walked out. So, yeah, that was the only time I took a class, and it sounds like it went really well, doesn't it? But anyway, Yes, back to 2018. This is the time, in case you're still listening, guys, that the Tren de Aragua is on its way to building a big national, or transnational even, criminal empire. So before this, we're going to take it back to the history of the group and how they got to this point, right? So I'm going to go back to 2005. That year, a 22-year-old named Hector Rustenford Guerrero Flores, a.k.a., thank God, because this is way easier, Niño Guerrero, murders a police officer in Aragua, which is a small, spleen-shaped state around 60 miles west of Caracas, which hugs the Caribbean Sea. Now, Guerrero is bumped around prison facilities, but in 2010, he has moved to a place called Tocoron, which is one of the largest in the country and close to the Aragua state capital of Maracay. He escapes 2 years later, but he's rearrested and sent back to Tocoron, which sounds like a good idea. So in 2013, Guerrero decides, okay, I'm just going to set up a gang right here. Now, Tocoron is no ordinary prison, as we're going to find out soon. But not only has Guerrero stumbled on the perfect criminal petri dish, he's done it at the perfect time too. In 2013, crime is so out of control in Caracas especially that the Venezuelan regime under Hugo Chavez, now dead of course, sets up a system of so-called peace zones. Remember Amsterdam from The Wire? Imagine that, but this is way more bonkers, basically just legalizing all crime for hundreds of gangs. Neighbourhoods designated as peace zones by authorities, they effectively suspend police operation altogether, so long as rampant gangs lay down their weapons, help maintain peace, and end activities such as drug dealing. They even give the gangs cash to start up legit businesses. The gangs are like, hell yeah, Senor Chavez, we'll be good if your cops stay out of our hoods, but the thing about gangs is they're pretty bad at keeping their word. So pretty soon, peace zones just become shorthand for absolute lawless insanity. The gangs recruit even more members, they sling more gear, and add to their state handouts by making bank shaking down anybody in their path. Here's the always great Insight Crime quote. Remarkably, the gangs managed to get away with crimes committed outside the peace zones, since police chasing them would often turn back as soon as they got near the border. If security forces did venture inside the peace zones in search of suspects, they were frequently called back by their superiors. The most powerful gang leader in Venezuela by this point is not Niño Guerrero, however. It is a guy named Carlos Luis Revete, a.k.a. El Coqui, and the El Coqui gang has control of whole swathes of the capital city, banking Venezuela's special form of criminal communism. Coqui, imagine a cross between Patrick Fischler and Ninja from Die Antwoord. He has connections in the notoriously corrupt Venezuelan military. Actually, I thought the Venezuelan armed forces would be packed to the gills like most socialist states, but it's only got around 120,000 active personnel, which is fewer than Cambodia or Greece. Anyway, Coqui's stronghold is a small district in southwest Caracas called Cota 905, and he kills off rivals to basically take over the city altogether. Unlike every other major crook in Caracas, he's never served time behind bars, and despite the average career for a Venezuelan gangster being about as long as the average NFL linebacker, by 2018, Coqui has made it to the ripe old age of 40. He is basically the king of Caracas. That same year, though, Tren de Aragua is making its own moves. Tren, by the way, the Aragua train. Nobody's entirely sure where the name came from, but Inside Crime thinks it might have come from a labour union working on a never-finished railroad in the state. Niño, by 2018, he's orchestrated territory grabs from other gangs from his prison cell, and he's turned Tocoron prison into his own personal fiefdom. This is thanks to another massive government misstep, something called the Prane system, Prane. That might sound funny to Brits of a certain age. I remember you couldn't go an hour without calling someone a pranny in school. It's basically a moron. But you wouldn't be calling a pranny. No, sir.
British slang is like the gift that keeps on giving.
That sounds like a pretty pranny thing to say. These are crime bosses the authorities have ceded control of prisons to. Yes, you heard that. And they've done it officially. Here's another Inside Crime article from a couple years back. I promise I did not just copy-paste the entire episode from their website. Quote, prisoners must pay the pranes a weekly or monthly fee to guarantee their safety. They must also pay for water, food and transport to court hearings, as well as any family or conjugal visits. At Tocoron, Guerrero Flores charges causes or causas from other prisoners to allow them to live there. This fee was set at $8 per week per prisoner as early as 2022. Multiplying this amount by the number of inmates at Tocoron, 2,700, would mean that Niño Guerrero's operation potentially brings in up to $86,400 per month, or over $1 million a year. I mean, this is a piss poor country, remember. $1 million is a hell of a lot of money, which it shouldn't be. I should remind you again, Venezuela has the largest proven crude oil reserves on the planet. In 1999, the year Hugo Chavez came to power, it produced 3.6 million barrels a day, making it one of the world's largest producers. Today, it's down to 85,000. But Niño Guerrero is doing pretty well, and he decks out Tocoron with a zoo, swimming pool, playground, restaurant, and a nightclub. And if you ever partied at that nightclub, we want to hear from you. The Underworld Podcast at gmail.com.
I don't just want to hear from them. Like, I want to go to there.
You want to go there, yeah. Yeah, so do I, actually. Can someone just fund us? Can someone just give us money, actually? We won't go there. We won't do anything. Just give us money. At the same time, in 2018, so this is really a pivotal year for this whole story, one of Niño's closest lieutenants in the Tren, a guy named Amaura Alvarez, a.k.a. Larry Changa, which sounds like an early Seinfeld character, he bursts out of Tocoron and he escapes to Chile. We'll come back to that soon. The gang expands its portfolio to extortion, kidnapping, drugs, illegal mining, cybercrime, and a bit of boring old theft. But the biggest cash cow, in a country leaking people quicker than a Man City game on 85 minutes, so I can do UK references as well, is human trafficking and smuggling. Trafficking, by the way, is against the person's will. Smuggling is at their will. Very, very important distinction. In 2018, Tren de Aragua attempts to establish itself on the porous border between Venezuela and Colombia, and it clashes with a bunch of Colombian rebel groups along the way. Some of them beat up on the Tren, but the gang carves out a niche ferrying folks into the Colombian town of La Parada. Gang associates then set up cells across Latin America, including Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Brazil. They even forged ties with Brazil's largest organized criminal group, the First Capital Control, or PCC.
Yeah, we did an episode on them, I think, a year back or so. If you haven't heard it, go back and listen.
They're all over the place now. They really are one of the biggest organized criminal groups in the world, I would imagine. The Tren's first move is usually to found loan sharking enterprises called gota a gota, or drop by drop. Wherever the group tries to get into narco trafficking in a big way, it seems to get its backside handed to it by bigger cartels. But nobody is prepared for the gigantic exodus of Venezuelans from their homeland, and the Tren steps in to claim massive profits off the back of it. It's also benefiting hugely from the peace zone plan too, carving out a stronghold in the Maracay district of San Vicente. The Tren then uses its state cash to start a foundation called Somos el Barrio JK, which I think translates to We Are the Hood, only joking. This thing begins as a charity, but pretty soon it's just a vehicle for Niño's personal despotism. It hands out food only to those who follow gang rules, which can be as petty as having particular lights or plants outside their homes. Tren members can dictate the colours homes will be painted in, or which decorations folk can put up with for Navidad, for example. But it's not just the home decor the Tren are interested in. When a police officer stands up to the gang, for example, they shoot him 50 times, then tie his body to a motorcycle and drag it through the streets. 2019 sees an even bigger coup for the group, and it comes by way of a police screw-up even Caracas hasn't seen by this point. In July that year, a group of police officers break the Peace Zone Pact not to enter Cotton 905, which is Coquí's turf, and they're on orders to find stolen vehicles. By this point, the entire neighbourhood has become a junkyard slum. It's pandemonium. Very quickly upon entering, these officers are surrounded by Coquí's men, who are stationed on higher ground and armed with high-powered weapons like AR-15s and AK-47s. It's a shooting gallery, and the police have to scatter for their lives. taking with them stories of how the peace zone plan has turned entire sections of the cities into smouldering Mad Max-style killing fields, with groups like coquis resembling less street gangs than paramilitary outfits. Even the miserable regime of Nicolás Maduro can't ignore this level of misrule, and arguments to dismantle the peace zones gather pace. This standoff crescendos until early 2021, and that's when cocky, cocky, expands out of Cota 905 to take the nearby district of La Vega, prompting an outcry. The regime fights back, pushing Cocky not only out of La Vega, but Cota too. Suddenly, Cocky is on the run, and his turf is in tatters. That's great news for the Tren de Aragua, which has consolidated its own power from Tocorón to Venezuela and out across the whole region. That September, the mayor of Bogotá, Colombia's capital city, comes out against the group, asking the Venezuela ambassador to, quote, effectively isolate these two criminals from any possibility of continuing to coordinate criminal activities from the Tocorón prison. That's a pretty big deal. You've got the mayor of a major city home to over 7 million people, which of course has seen its own fair share of narco violence going back to the 1980s, name-dropping the Tren and Niño as forces to be reckoned with. And to call out Tocorón in particular reflects just how disastrously the Venezuelan system of pranes has been. A state prison watchdog at this point analyses 31 of 52 prisons in Venezuela and finds that 8 are entirely controlled by organised crime bosses, while another 15 are at least partially mob-controlled. Only 8 are controlled by the government. Madness. Writes Insight Crime, quote, Niño Guerrero has ordered inmates to carry out work at Tocorón, according to the investigator. Some are given cleaning assignments, while others are charged with feeding the animals at the prison zoo. Inmates who have financial knowledge or information technology skills run accounts or teach others how to conduct extortion scams via social media and other platforms.
Like the prison zoo, do we know what they're talking about here? Like, is it a couple of goats and chickens, or is it like tigers and monkeys and stuff?
I'm pretty sure I went looking online to see if they had tigers, because, as we both know, that's my obsession for some reason. And they said no. I don't think anything came back about tigers. But I don't know. Yeah, if you've just got goats and chickens, can you call yourself a zoo? When does a farm become a zoo? I want to know that. That's a really important distinction. But if they call it a zoo, I'm going to call it a zoo. I realise now I'm talking like Donald Trump, so I'm going to leave it there. Anyway, you think prison gangs are bad in the States? This one is off the hook. I mean, you might have guessed that already by the existence of a zoo and a nightclub. But remember Niño's capo, Larry Changa, who busted out of Tocorón in 2015 and migrated to Chile? In 2022, Chilean cops finally catch up with him, and he flees to Colombia, working with and against rebels like the FARC to commandeer more and more of the Venezuelan migrant trafficking market, which soars as the country's economy continues to tank. Remember though, those big narco bucks, they're well out of reach of the Tren. It'd take more than a handful of cojones to go after the cartels in Colombia, Peru, and Central America. And so much of the jungle routes for blow are taxed by non-state actors, again, like the FARC. So the Tren's big money is in migrants, then extortion, cybercrime, and then your more domestic drug work. In that order. On February 6, 2022, security forces spot El Coqui, who's been on the lam since the breakdown of his gang the previous year, while they're in a shootout with a different gang on an Aragua highway, which is insane. And they open fire on him, popping him in the arm. Turns out, despite offering a $500,000 reward and claiming Coquí's been sheltered by the Colombian government, he's just been hiding in a provincial town in Venezuela with this other gang, Los Conejos, which I think is the rabbits. Anyway, for months he's been doing this. Coqui flees into the forest, but not before he drops his cell phone, on which is a picture of him with long hair and a beard. He then legs it with the forces in close pursuit. The resulting manhunt continues until February 8th, 3 days later, when they finally get the better of him, shooting him dead. It's at the tail end of this year, 2022, that you first start to hear about the Tren de Aragua coming north to the US, The American Border Patrol claims to CNN Español that it's arrested 38 possible Tren members between October 2022 and October 2023, for example. But we're going to get onto some of these law enforcement and media claims about the gang, because some of them are fishier than your mum's the chowder that she makes on weekends. Lots of fish in that chowder, very generous woman.
Oh my God, dude, that is bad even for you. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? I referenced the MS-13 stuff, and it's kind of like
similar.
It's tough to parse because it's kind of nuanced. Like with MS, they're very bad people. Like they were very dangerous. They were extremely violent and definite cause for concern. But it was also portrayed like this massive invasion, this group that was coming to take your kids. When the reality is, they're definitely coming, right? But it's in smaller numbers, and they almost always only prey on their own, right? MS was preying on Salvadoran and other Central American immigrant communities, which, it doesn't make it better or less concerning, but like, you know what I'm saying? Like they make it out to be something about this thing that it's going to terrorize, every suburb and all that sort of stuff. But I guess maybe it is a good thing, that they're highlighting the fact that these groups are coming here and that they are terrorizing these immigrant communities who a lot of people don't care about. So I don't know, but it's an interesting thing to parse media-wise, and I'm assuming it's very similar with this gang now garnering the same MS-13 type headlines.
Yeah, it's really similar, actually. And I think, like, every time there's been an individual case where this group has popped up, I think there's always the attraction to writing a bit of the story, which is like a little bit of backstory that makes it seem like they're fully invading the place, which... Right. Yeah, doesn't seem like it's fully... I'm not really fully on board with it, having read a bunch of stuff. But yeah, you can pass your own thoughts about this, because I'm going to go into a few of these cases, and some of them are really interesting. One big change, though, which doesn't help the Tren, is actually that Venezuelans are coming to the US in greater numbers. Until 2022, the Tren has done well fighting off competition for popular migrant routes into neighbouring countries like Colombia. But when caravans switch direction and head north, these are the routes, like the drugs, that are already commanded by far bigger and deadlier gangs. And this is even still the case today. Not to say Tren members aren't arriving in the US themselves in these groups.
Yeah, I mean, those routes that come up from Central America into Mexico into the US, I mean, those are controlled by, Zetas or Sinaloa, like cartels that are not to be trifled with.
Yeah, and it's like I said, like whenever they've tried to get into the narco trafficking in a big way, it seems like they've been battered down by these groups. And they've carved out this little niche on the Colombian border, which is where the majority of people were going to. But now people are going north. It's not so good for them, although we'll hear that they're still definitely up and operating. Even more spectacularly, on September 20, 2023, Maduro's regime decides it's had enough of Niño and his Tocoron prison, come zoo, come cyber scamming center, come nightclub, whatever it is. Early that morning, 11,000 members of the Venezuelan security services storm the prison. 11,000. And there are only 7,000 inmates. An official statement reads, quote, "The Bolivarian government informs that the Cacique Guaycapuro, I'm surely not saying that right, liberation operation has been underway since the early hours of the morning. Its objective is to dismantle and put an end to organized crime gangs and other criminal networks operating from the Tocoron penitentiary, to the detriment of the tranquility of the Venezuelan people." That name, by the way, in case you missed it, Cacique Guaycapuro, is a 16th century native chief, which is why I pronounced it so well. Niño and the Tren lose Tocoron. Job done, right? Wrong. Niño and his top boys escape without harm. Apparently they've been given advance warning of the raid. So that's kind of where we are with the Tren in their home country. Scattered but not broken, shaken but not stirred. Niño is nowhere to be found, and his lieutenants have fanned out across the Americas. Incredible numbers of Venezuelans are now coming across the US border at this point. 800,000 have tried crossing since 2021, with a mammoth 330,000 Venezuelans trying it last year alone. That is unlikely to subside given Maduro's recent election still, with some estimates saying that another 40% of the country could flee in the coming couple of years. Of course, the vast majority of these people are not gangsters or criminals. According to the Biden administration, just over 1% of migrants have arrived since he took office have criminal records. But Venezuela, likewise China, Cuba, and a handful of other countries whose name you can probably guess, they don't release law enforcement data to the US, nor do they take their nationals back on deportation flights, which makes things a lot tougher for US authorities. And look, I'm not going to get into like Day of the Soldado type stuff here, but this just objectively is not good stuff for America. And on November 27th, 2023, something happens in Miami that ignites the American media consciousness about the Tren de Aragua, however deep its connections in the States may truly be. That night, two women seduce a man named Jose Luis Sanchez Barrera, a 43-year-old former Venezuelan cop. The pair takes Sanchez to a La Quinta Inn hotel and suites in Miami, where they engage in, I guess, fun. When the fun is over, though, Sanchez is jumped by three men outside the hotel, who drag him to the back of his own truck, tie his hands and feet, and torture him, trying to get details about where he hides his valuables and cash. Sanchez tells them his address and the combination to a safe. They then drive there, where they threaten to kill Sanchez's niece so she'll hand over anything of value to them. Speaking to Univision, the niece says, quote, "They pointed a gun at my head and told me that if I didn't cooperate, they would kill me. They made me kneel while they searched the room. They searched everything. They took all my things. They also stripped me of my clothes. They took his safe." Minutes later, the gang speeds off, with Sanchez still in the back of his truck. His cousin tracks his phone to a nearby street where, the following morning, cops find the truck covered in blood. Sanchez is inside, dead. His hands are still bound, his body covered in bruises, and his head is covered in a shirt. This is how he'd been killed, suffocated. A pretty horrible death. Detectives arrest one of the men and tell media he's a member of the Tren de Aragua. A few months later, on April 17 this year, 2024, an El Paso Border Patrol intel unit alerts Homeland Security about a sex ring involving the Tren. A young woman has reached out to them, claiming to have been trafficked across the Texas border and onto Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where she's been sexually exploited by criminals threatening to kill her kids back home in Venezuela. The young woman claims she's been held at this brothel to pay off a $30,000 debt to a human trafficker who'd brought her into the US. Cops then raid a property in Baton Rouge and find sex toys, over $1,000 in cash and a ledger of debts, arresting a group of Venezuelan men, including an alleged ringleader of the Tren, in the US. They then discover that this one guy has been operating so-called human trafficking stash houses across the country, including across Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, New Jersey, and Florida. This is all getting a bit True Detective, eh? The gang has, quote, followed the migration paths across South America to other countries and have set up criminal groups throughout South America as they follow these paths, and that they appear to follow the migration north to the United States. That's according to an El Paso FBI special agent.
Yeah, I mean, the sex trafficking stuff, I think, from Venezuela is like a huge problem. Even 7 or 8 years ago, it was becoming a thing in Trinidad, which is, right off the coast of Venezuela. I think, I'm not sure if it was specifically sex trafficking or just women there were becoming sex workers. But I assume it was probably a mix of both.
Yeah, how closely are those two countries linked with criminal stuff? Because, it's pretty amazing if you look at the map how close Trinidad is to the coast of Venezuela. And is it Curacao as well? It's right down there off the coast as well.
Yeah, I mean, with Trinidad, it was becoming a big thing in 2013, 2014, and it was always like a sort of midway point or way station for trafficking of cocaine. But there were gangs there that were getting more involved in Trinidad in the last parts of the 2010s because there were so many refugees that were flooding in there.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I mean, Venezuelan history is just a complete basket case from start to finish, really. Anyway, after this, we get to all the stuff going down in New York from the cold open with our moped attempted killer and stories about gang members camping out in migrant homes, which is all grist for the media mill, of course, but definitely scary too. Over in Denver, cops have released intelligence claiming that regional members of the Tren have been given a, quote, green light to open fire on cops there, given how violently the gang responds to police back home. And in Miami, of course.
Yeah, I just saw, a headline today in the Post was, Wave the gun. Armed crew storms Colorado apartment building overrun by Venezuelan gang spilling out from Sanctuary City. And it's basically about Tren. But I think there's a debate. The governor is saying that it is not them. And it's in Aurora, the Denver suburb. And the Aurora Police Department acknowledged it is aware that components of Tren de Aragua are operating in Aurora, saying that the police force has been increasingly collecting evidence to show the gang is connected to crimes in the area.
Interesting. So, yeah, I did see a few different things from Denver, but again, like some of them seem legit and some of them seemed a bit sort of speculative, but yeah, this seems pretty out there. I wouldn't be surprised if they're really well embedded. There's enough of them, and there's so many people coming into the country that I would not be surprised if there was a significant number of gang members. But yeah, this is not just in the US either. It's not just in Denver. It's not just in New York. Remember how Niño's boy Larry Changa fled to Chile to set up shop there? Not uncoincidentally, Chile's murder rate has shot up since 2019 to 4.5 out of 100,000 today, which is still pretty low. It's actually below the US. But Changa and his Tren men have turned entire historic buildings in the capital city Santiago into mega brothels for sex trafficking. And the Tren has even been accused of collaboration with the Maduro regime in the killing of a prominent anti-Maduro activist, Ronald Ojeda, who had been living in exile in Santiago since 2018, but whose body was found this March inside a suitcase buried beneath a building on the edge of the city, sprinkled with lime powder to speed up decomposition. He's dead, by the way, just to get that clear. It's not a pretty sight. And all the hallmarks of a gang hit. Chile has already pointed the finger directly at its Venezuelan counterparts. Quote, Venezuela is not collaborating with the countries of the South, and that is according to Chile's Interior Ministry.
That's pretty wild, right? I think it reminds me of similar stuff with, I think Iran was contracting out gang members in like Sweden to take out dissidents. I think there's stuff with Chechnya too, right? Something along those lines. But states using gang members in these places to in places where you assume there's a lot more Western Europe, whatever is Eastern Europe. I think Poland was one of them too, where they're using gang members to kill dissidents.
Yeah, it's nuts actually how quickly this story is accelerating, because I think I wrote this episode, maybe a week or two ago, and even since the election and all the fallout from that, election in inverted commas, it's definitely true, and I definitely see it reported in the media more, that as Maduro sinks into ever more desperate levels of dictatorship, he's clinging on by a thread, it seems, and his economy worsens and his people continue to flee, he's going to turn to the black market to keep the Bolivarian revolution alive. Illegal gold and oil already make the regime a lot of cash. But as Venezuela deepens ties with the likes of Iran, North Korea and Russia, why not go the Kim Jong-un way altogether and try getting some ghost GDP from the drug trade via the Tren? It's not actually that outlandish to suggest so, and they're definitely involved in this killing in Chile. But I think at this point it's worth pouring little cold water on the idea that Tren de Aragua is invading the United States wholesale. Yes, the stories I've mentioned here are grim, and the opportunities for Venezuelan criminals are growing. In March, a group of Republicans, including Marco Rubio, called for President Biden to designate the Tren an official transnational criminal organization, or TCO, calling it a, quote, invading criminal army, spreading, quote, brutality and chaos. But Insight Crime, God bless you guys, has looked into a lot of the claims and found them unfounded. There have been a bunch of arrests where cops have called guys Tren members because they've got a certain tattoo, but they don't actually know anything about the gang. The criminals, that is. The lawmaker's letter accuses the gang of child rape, something that hasn't once been substantiated or even mentioned in cases about it. A February murder in Georgia had been attributed to the Tren before officials backtracked. Again, it seemed to have hinged entirely on one guy's tattoo. The State Department has offered big rewards for Niño and two of his top guys, alongside officials in Colombia, of all places. But these men are believed to be hiding out in Venezuela. And actually, if you go through the stories, including the New York Post, they seem confused as to whether the Tren actually has its own tattoos or not. In some cases, they say they're similar to MS-13 in the fact they have these like really identifiable tats, but in other cases, they actually come out and say they don't do that so they can blend in. So it's quite confusing. I mean, these guys are big and they're scary and they're violent, and they have come out of an extraordinary crucible of lawlessness and decay in Venezuela. But MS-13 or Barrio 18, I mean, they are not there yet. I guess the TLDR of this entire episode is Venezuela broken, getting brokener, and the Tren de Aragua, not nice, watch this space. That is the kind of top-level analysis we are here for.
Yeah. For more, I think, Sean, you spoke to John Lee Anderson, who's done some amazing reporting in Venezuela. Patreon.com/Underworld Podcast for bonus episodes. You can also sign up on Spotify or on iTunes, and it goes directly to your feed. And, until next week.